Welcome to Notes 2.3 from Ms. Richardson and Mr. Culhane's U.S. History class. We're going to title them The Fun. Wait, that's not quite right. Because in these, the fun is going to end and the Great Depression is going to begin. So Notes 2.3 for U.S. History is The Fun Ends and the Great Depression Begins. So this half of the unit is a very big contrast to earlier in the unit. If you notice the two pictures, I put them here for a reason. First, you have everybody having a great time in their new car, and then the guy trying to sell his car for $100 because he lost everything in the stock market. So just a very different feel from the 20s to the 30s. So we'll start off looking at the stock market because we had that picture where the man just lost all his money in the stock market. Throughout the 20s, we know that Americans were investing in the stock market. They were buying stocks on margin. We've learned about margin in class, and through the 20s, stock prices went up. So if you look at a graph of the 1920s stock market, up, 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 up. So you can see they just kept going up, and this one has some events that helped cause that. So stock market looked like a good investment. Americans invest, they buy on margin. Things are going great. And you know this from class. And then the crash. So everything worked well until October of 1929. In October of 1929, there were fewer new customers buying stocks, and when more people were interested in stock, that brought the price up. So we had fewer people buying, and that led to a deflation of prices, so prices went down. Inflation, prices go up. Deflation, prices go down. So prices lower, prices had been falsely inflated because of margin buying, and on October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashes. So this day where everything crashed is called Black Tuesday. October 29th, 1929, the stock market plummeted, as you saw in the graph. And suddenly, everyone lost their money. So if you owed on margin, you owed money you didn't even have. So billions were lost, between $10 and $15 billion, with a B, in 1929, was lost in the stock market on that day because the prices were not really that high to begin with. People rushed to the market, to Wall Street, to try to get their money, and there wasn't any money for them. So people had just lost their entire life savings due to the stock market crash, which meant they had nothing. So what? So why does this end up mattering? Well, everybody who bought on margin still had to pay back the money they owed on their original purpose, even if the stock is worthless. So even if the stock has gone bankrupt, you still have to pay that 90% because someone loaned it to you. So people rush to the banks to try to take their money out so they can pay back these purchases that they owe. They want to cash out, pay back the purchase before they lose even more money in the stock market. Well, banks don't have that much money on hand. And in fact, banks invest in the stock market because that's how they pay for your loans. So the banks really didn't have that kind of money on hand. The banks literally ran out of money to give customers. And so as banks started running out of money to give customers, they started closing. And when people saw that banks were closing and they were losing their entire life savings, everything that was in the bank where it should be safe, there started to have these bank runs, and people were running to the banks to try to get their money out. Even banks that had money were affected by the bank failures because people came to that bank to try to get the money. So everybody was worried their bank would fail, so they show up trying to get the money. And you see in actual photographs here where there are lines around the corner, down the street, blocks and blocks of people trying to get their money out of the banks because they were afraid that they would lose their money. And because so many people were worried about that, we actually ended up with more banks failing, as you can see here in this graph. So you can see in 1929 there is a small jump. To 1930 there's an even larger jump, and it gets bigger in 31. It does drop in 32, but we see another large jump in 33. So during the Great Depression, many people lost their savings in the bank failures. And this actually created a distrust of many people during this time period for banks. Today you don't have to worry about it as much. There's some things that were put into place in the 30s, but know that when you see somebody who's maybe elderly who lived through the Depression, they may not trust banks, and this is why. So these are all important events, and they're the events that sparked the Great Depression and really kick it off and start it. So Black Tuesday is seen as the start of the Great Depression, but they're not the actual causes of the Great Depression. So these things would have been bad, but they wouldn't have caused depression if there weren't underlying issues. So the question becomes, what caused the Great Depression? Well, our first cause is uneven distribution of wealth and income. And for these causes, you do need to know them, and there's a lot of information on these, so you might want to pause as you go through these to have some time to write them down. So uneven distribution of wealth and income, most Americans could not afford the products they were buying and helping to produce, which led to buying on credit. So now we have all these people with a lot of debt and credit. They can't afford to buy more, and so if you can't afford to buy more, factories quit producing. And if they quit producing, you don't need all the employees, so they start laying people off. This would have happened whether the stock market crashed or not. But because people were laid off and then they lost their savings, it was an even bigger hit. Our second cause is the loss of export sales. So fewer foreign companies were buying American goods. We had put a tariff on a lot of foreign goods. So when we're putting this high tax on foreign goods coming into the country, they quit importing as many American goods. So actually we didn't need the factories for this either because we weren't exporting, which means more factories shut down, more jobs are lost, and more people need that savings, which then disappears in the bank runs. Our third cause of the Great Depression is mistakes by the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is a group from the government. It's an agency, essentially, that regulates our monetary system in the U.S. They determine interest rates and things like that. So in the 20s, they kept interest rates very low. Well, people were buying a lot on credit and margin with low interest. That means you have to pay back less. So like if you borrowed $10, you have to pay back $1, where if you had high interest rates, you'd have to pay back $2 or $3 dollars for every 10 that you borrowed. Well, this meant that people were more willing to borrow. And if people are more willing to borrow, then that's risky behavior because you owe money. And so they make business think the economy is expanding, they take out more loans, people take out more loans, and then the Federal Reserve, when the Depression hits, actually raises interest rates. That makes it harder to get credit and people owe more money. That actually makes things worse rather than better. They kind of did it backwards. If they had had higher interest rates in the 20s, there would have been less borrowing. Lower interest rates in the 30s would have made it easier for people to pay things back. So this man ends up the one we blame for the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover, the 31st president of the United States, takes office in 1929. And remember, the stock market crashes in October of 1929, his very first year in office. So Hoover is seen as the cause of the Great Depression, or one of the causes. He is blamed for the Great Depression. So Hoover is really blamed for the Depression because during the Depression, during Hoover's administration, the Depression really worsens and is terrible for most people. 9,000 banks fail. 30,000 companies go out of business every year. That means 12 million Americans are unemployed, and you can see on the graph how unemployment rates went up. That means more people were unemployed during this time period, especially it starts in 29 and goes up to 33. It's just a steady increase. So all those people were unemployed. That's almost a quarter of the American public, the American workforce. And the average income dropped by $700, which doesn't sound like a lot, $700 a month, but when you look at that, $700, that's almost a quarter, 25%. So people are making 25% less than they did before, and a quarter of the people are unemployed. So what choices did these unemployed and lower employed people have? Well, I'm going to show you this slide a couple times, so don't feel like you need to write everything right now. There's no government help. There is no unemployment insurance. There is nothing, no food stamps. So their one choice is bread lines. So these were public charities who came up with the idea they would have soup and bread and they would give it out. So they'd have a house. I mean, we still have these kinds of places, food kitchens, things like that, food pantries. They'd have a place and they'd give it out, and look at these lines for people waiting, wanting to get just a meal, and it might be your only meal that day. And it all relied on the charity of strangers. And these people were relying on donations, and when things are bad, there were fewer donations because there were fewer people with money. So when they ran out of food, the bread line closed. So again, here we're back to the same slide. Hoovervilles. People ended up living in these shanty towns, these shacks that were unused or public land that was around the cities. They lost their homes. They couldn't afford to actually move. So all over the country, we have these Hoovervilles set up. And sometimes the police would come in and try to break them up and get rid of them, but these people had nowhere else to go. So all these Americans who were displaced because of the Depression would build these shacks and live in them. They're called Hoovervilles after the president everyone blamed for this. So, as you can see, people blame Hoover. These are not houses you'd want to live in. They're not safe. They're not sturdy. They are built out of whatever people could find because you can't afford building materials. Sometimes they're even built in dumps. And so people are living in these, and they're huge, huge places. Just hundreds of people living in these. So this was your new neighborhood when you were doing so well before. And finally, we actually have a lot of men and boys who become hobos. And because they've lost their homes, they've lost their jobs, they can't support their families, so they start just traveling around the country illegally on the railroads, jumping trains, things like that. So you can see, very dangerous lifestyle because they have no jobs and they're looking for jobs, they're looking for places to live. Notice these guys aren't that old and they're jumping on the moving train because you're not allowed to do this. So we have entire camps of them, and they even came up with symbols to communicate with one another about what type of neighborhood it was. So if you look at these, I think they're kind of interesting here to see it's safe here, there's a lot of cops here, there's some friendly people here, you can get food from these people, and so this really became a lifestyle during this time period. So sorry farmers, your life still does not get better, in fact it gets worse. So during the 20s, things were already doing really bad for the farmers, and we said prices dropped, which meant land went unused, more and more people ended up unemployed, and so people aren't planting. We end up with a dust storm. So we have a massive drought that happens during 1932, and things get even worse. And as you can see, the dirt blowing, the dust storms, how much things are covered. This ends up being called the Dust Bowl in the Midwest because these storms would blow in because there's no grass or plants holding the ground down. The soil just dries up, becomes just dust, and anytime there's large windstorms, it literally blows away the ground. So even farmers that were still farming, their crops would actually get smothered by this dust, which would kill those plants. They can't pay their mortgages, they lose their homes, they're completely displaced, and they actually end up having to travel the country with all their belongings, as you can see, their families, looking for work. And they come up with this term Okies, and that's on your study guide, and it is these displaced farmers. Okie specifically is referencing Oklahoma, but that doesn't really matter to people. Okie is just a derogatory term about who those farmers were that were looking for work and traveling around during this time period. So the Okies were not welcome in these different places, and Okies, like I said, just referred to any farmers that were itinerant, looking for work, migrating around. And as you see, they're traveling, they join Hoovervilles, they stay in roadside camps looking for work, and they just can't find it because there is no work anywhere in the U.S. And so this final picture, this is our last piece, is titled Migrant Mother, and it's from one of our most famous photographers of the time period, Dorothea Lange. So Dorothea Lange was a photographer who during the 1930s traveled around to these different Hoovervilles and migrant worker camps and photographed the life of the people during the time. So there's all kinds of pictures that she has taken, but this is probably the most famous that you've probably seen before. The mother with her children sitting on the side of the road because they can't go anywhere else. Her husband has gone looking for work, and this is what their lives have become. So this is the end of Notes 2.3, The Great Depression Begins. So make sure that you are ready for your quiz next week, and bring any questions you have to class.